Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? I've put together this show for you for today, Thursday, August 15th, 2019. Didn't want to leave you without new content for quite so long, but really, there were so many stories that were piling up that we really felt like, I really felt like we really needed to get to, that I thought it was unfair, basically, and also I was bursting at the seams, essentially, with stories in pocket. And so I thought I'd sit down and see if I can quickly put together this broadcast for you today, just to get you through the day and to catch up on some of these stories. For instance, I was disappointed in not being able to get all the way through the Washington Post report yesterday on how a McConnell-backed effort to lift Russian sanctions boosted a Kentucky project. You know, we all knew the background of that Rusal-backed aluminum plant being placed there in Kentucky, but we didn't make it all the way through the story, and the not quite necessarily fully illustrated situation of possible quid pro quo between the Russians who were making the investment and looking to get sanctions lifted against them at the same time. But we also didn't get to the Time magazine reporting on that subject, which, although I referred you to it and offered you the opportunity to read it by including it in yesterday's roundup of the show, I'm not certain that you were able to do it, and I'm not certain that we have completely covered the subject until we've gotten to it. So I thought I actually would continue with the reading from yesterday and finish up the Washington Post piece we had left off last by explaining illustrating the showdown between Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Minority Leader Chuck Schumer on the floor over the sanctions question, and eventually the fact that Schumer lost out in this and McConnell was able to hold on to enough Republican votes to kill the thing via filibuster so that they couldn't get past a cloture vote on this. McConnell eventually just calling Schumer's entire resolution a political stunt, even though a similar resolution had passed overwhelmingly and with tremendous Republican support in the House. At any rate, we left off there after the accusation that it was a political stunt and rejection of the claims from McConnell by McConnell that he or others in the GOP were soft on Putin. He concluded by saying, "We Republicans are hardly strangers to the need for strong policies concerning Russia. We have long seen Vladimir Putin for the KGB thug that he is." And I guess they also have seen his bank account as well and decided to go along. At McConnell's urging, the story continues and continues toward conclusion here. At McConnell's urging, the measure was defeated on January 16th, falling 3 votes short of the required 3/5 majority needed to overcome that threatened filibuster. Joining in opposition, as we did note, was GOP junior senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul. A spokesman for Paul said the senator was unaware of the prospect of a major Rusal investment in Kentucky at the time, and said he voted against the measure because he opposes sanctions against Russia, Iran, and North Korea as a matter of principle, which is really interesting, to say the least. We were not involved, consulted, or aware of any investment discussions with any foreign entity before the sanctions vote, said Kelsey Cooper, Paul's communications director. Similarly, McConnell said he was not motivated by any Kentucky interests, amazingly enough. It was completely unrelated to anything that might happen in my home state. McConnell told reporters at the Capitol in May, a number of us supported the administration, and that's how I voted. That's the reason I voted the way I did. The final section of the piece here, under a new partnership. Less than 2 weeks after that January vote, Treasury announced that it had accepted Rusal's plan to limit Deripaska's control over the company and removed sanctions. 4 weeks later, Rusal executives were in Ashland touring Brady's mill site. By April, the new partnership was announced. As part of the deal, Barker, the British head of Rusal's holding company, will become co-chairman of Brady Atlas, the company that will operate the mill. Bouchard, who said he had watched the Senate sanctions vote live on television, was thrilled. For me, to this day, this is one of the greatest things that ever happened to Northeast Kentucky. Rusal saying yes to our deal, Bouchard said. Particularly if you think about Appalachia and what's happened there. You know, those people today are jumping up and down and welcoming them, Rusal, because they're helping to rebuild the community. I bet they're not jumping up and down, but okay. With sanctions lifted, EN Plus is exploring and acting on strategically expanding our global partnership and opportunities, including in the United States, the company said in a statement. EN Plus is, quote, the only global producer capable, unquote, of supplying Brady with the low-carbon aluminum it had been seeking, and as a result, the whole project would not have been possible without Rusal's investment, the company said, which again is amazing that they made it so far in proposing such a project in the middle of Appalachia without any guarantee whatsoever of being able to get the aluminum they said they wanted to process. That seems very unlikely to me. Despite the 2018 groundbreaking, Bouchard agreed that getting the mill open would have been difficult without Rusal. It would have imposed upon us a real challenge that would have been tough, he said. Brady is gathering additional investors and hopes to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. The firm plans to begin producing aluminum sheets by September of 2021. In Ashland, Brady has opened a headquarters in a downtown office building, but has not yet begun building on its site, city officials said. And some lawmakers are voicing concern about Rusal's role, including Representative James Comer, Republican of Kentucky, a McConnell ally who has clashed with Bevin and criticized state investment in a project whose prospects, he said, appear uncertain. I hope we can get some jobs there, but it's not looking real good for this business, Comer said in a television interview in April. I would not have taken the Russian money if I was a startup. On Friday, the chief financial officer of Rusal said during an earnings call reported by Bloomberg News that the company could pull out of the project if U.S. officials continue applying pressure on the company. The comment was an apparent reference to recent efforts by Democratic senators led by Ron Wyden of Oregon to secure a review of the Kentucky deal from the U.S. government agency charged with examining national security implications of foreign investments. Barker issued a statement from London saying Rusal's parent company, quote, remains committed to the project. Bouchard, in a separate statement, blamed the media for taking an active role in trying to undermine a project that could create many jobs. Wyden rejected such complaints, saying he and several Senate colleagues were pushing ahead on a request for a review of the Russian investment. The national security of the United States is more important than the preference of a Russian company, Wyden said Sunday in a statement. I'm not going to let up because Rusal finds oversight inconvenient. And indeed, that is the conclusion of this piece. The other, from Time magazine, I think had an interesting bent that might not have been covered in all this. I thought we might explore it and see if that bears itself out. Time magazine's piece here by Simon Schuster in London and Vera Bergengruen in Ashland, Kentucky, working together on this one. A Kremlin-linked firm invested millions in Kentucky. Were they after more than money? This one, I think, takes or at least hints at taking a closer look at what this deal might really be about and whether or not it's warranted worrying about this being a political influence campaign in itself. Last summer, their story begins, it looked like things were finally about to change for Ashland, Kentucky. For 2 decades, the jobs that once supported this Appalachian outpost of 20,000 people on a bend in the Ohio River have been disappearing. 100 laid off from the freight rail maintenance shop. Dozens pink-slipped at the oil refinery. 1,100 axed at the steel mill that looms over the landscape. Then, On June 1st, 2018, standing on a stage flanked by the state's governor and business leaders, Craig Bouchard, the CEO of Brady Industries, pointed across a vast green field and described the vision as though he could already see it. In the little-used park just off I-64, Brady would build the largest aluminum mill constructed in the U.S. in nearly 4 decades. The $1.7 billion plant would take aluminum slab and roll it into the material used in everything from cars and planes to soda cans. It would employ 600 full-time workers, earning twice the average salary in the region, Bouchard said, and create 18,000 other jobs across the state. Gesturing at the empty space around him, the CEO described an employee health center, a technical lab, a daycare, and hundreds of employees walking around carrying iPads, because that sounds modern. More than just making aluminum, the plant would help rebuild northeast Kentucky and, in fact, all of Appalachia, Bouchard told the crowd. There's just one problem. Bouchard still needed a major investor to make the vision a reality. It seems like you would wait until you had done that. After months of searching, the only option was problematic. Rusal, the Russian aluminum giant, was tailor-made to join forces on the project, but it was under sanctions imposed by the U.S. Treasury Department. Its billionaire owner, Oleg Deripaska, a close ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin's, was being investigated by Special Counsel Robert Mueller for his potential involvement in the effort to swing the 2016 presidential election. The Treasury sanctions, punishment for the Kremlin's malign activities around the world, included attempting to subvert Western democracies, made it illegal for Americans to do business with Rusal or its boss. It's a major crime. So Bouchard faced a dilemma. Should I get rich building this plant, or should I, by getting into league with those attempting to subvert Western democracy, or is that important to me? Well, that's the big dilemma. Keeping his promise to bring good new jobs, a project that had already been touted by the White House, would mean partnering with a firm that had deep ties to the Kremlin, which wants nothing so much as to create good-paying jobs in the United States, I'm sure. Which mattered more, the economic needs of a depressed region? They are legitimate, right? Or the national security concerns raised by the Mueller investigation? Hundreds of miles from the congressional hearings and think tank debates over Russian influence in Washington, Brady Industries and the surrounding community had to weigh whether Russia's 2016 plot had caused enough damage to American security or American pride to spurn a chance at an economic miracle, which they usually pan out exactly as described, don't you think? That's usually the case with such things. Bouchard concluded they had no choice. He knew it could be controversial, if not outright illegal, to work on a deal with Rusal while it was still fighting to free itself from U.S. sanctions, he told Time in an interview. But after a long talk with his lawyers about the risks of even discussing such a partnership, he traveled to Zurich in January of 2019 for what he calls a meet and greet. I like to go to Zurich for meet and greets all the time. With a Rusal sales executive. Is that really who you would be talking to? Guess so. Over dinner at La Rôtisserie, a restaurant with a view of the city's 12th century cathedral, the executive told Bouchard that the company was ready to do business. They said, if we get the sanctions off, let's meet again, he recalls. And I said, wow, that's interesting, because it is interesting, because I was pretty sure that they just said that they didn't discuss the sanctions in the last piece, but maybe I recall that incorrectly. By mid-April, an exuberant Bouchard was standing at the New York Stock Exchange announcing that the Russian company had purchased a 40% stake in the Ashland plant for $200 million. Back in Kentucky, the news was met with celebration and relief. People who were skeptical are seeing that it's big time, says Chris Jackson, a 42-year-old former steel mill worker. When he enrolled in a training program for the Brady plant, Jackson recalls many in the community doubted the jobs would ever materialize. The Rusal agreement just showed everybody this is legit. Okay, so 40% stake for $200 million. That would mean that we're talking about a $500 million plant. But, of course, we were told at the beginning of this that this would be a $1.7 billion plant. So it's 3 times the price price tag on the plant that the Rusal Group was able to buy for $200 million. That seems like maybe I just don't understand the numbers here. But if you're building a $1.7 billion plant, how do you get 40% for a $200 million investment? They must really, really need that money, I guess. But to some observers, the story continues, the story of how a Kremlin-linked aluminum giant offered an economic lifeline to Appalachia is an object lesson of the exact opposite. Critics of the deal, both Democrat and Republican, say it gives Moscow political influence that could undermine national security. Here's the more interesting angle. Pointing to Moscow's use of economic leverage to sway European politics, they warn the deal is a stalking horse for a new kind of Russian meddling in America, one that exploits the U.S. free market system instead of its elections. That's just what the Russians do, says veteran diplomat Daniel Fried, who shaped U.S. policy on Eastern Europe at the State Department from the late 1980s until 2017. They insert themselves into a foreign economy and then start to influence its politics from the inside. And probably a better illustration of that than what's hinted at here. Like Daniel Fried shaped U.S. policy on Eastern Europe from the 80s on. Eastern Europe in the 80s, of course, was a very different place. But in a Western European context, we have heard extensively about the influence that the Russians had been able to wield, say, in German politics by becoming Germany's major supplier of energy, natural gas in particular, oil and natural gas, and building pipelines through Eastern Europe and through Germany, and being able to pull strings politically by threatening to jeopardize economically essential projects. So back to the story here. What worries national security experts is not that Rusal, Brady, or Deripaska broke any laws in the deal. It's that they didn't. A Time investigation found that Rusal used a broad array of political and economic tools to fight the sanctions, establishing a foothold in U.S. politics in the process. You cannot go against them in a policy decision, even though it's in our national interest, when they have infiltrated you economically, says Heather Conley, who served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under President George W. Bush. They used our laws, our rules, our banks, our lawyers, our lobbyists. It's a strategy from within. And it puts me in mind of thinking about the abstractions we've given time to here on the show about sometimes you can view it as a legitimate political aim to, for instance, as we constantly speculate on the show, advocate for outright political union between the United States and Russia. That what would stand in the way of a president exercising his prerogative to pursue that? The president is the person authorized by law and by the Constitution to pursue things like that. It may or may not be a good idea. It may or may not be popular politically. And it may be beyond the contemplation of most people, and many people, I'm sure, would initially say, that's impossible, it's illegal, it's unconstitutional. But it isn't. This is, of course, of a different sort of thing. This is using the system that we've got to influence our internal politics all the time, but usually we thought, I guess, reserved for domestic actors. And once we did begin to contemplate that foreign actors might want to get a piece of that action too, we did try and erect barriers prohibiting political contributions, for instance, to political candidates from foreign sources, but they blew through that too. But of course, that's not the allegation here. The allegation is that they actually played by the rules, which might reveal a certain weakness in our own system. So let me go back here and just to jump into back into the story where the thoughts are coherently laid out already, rather than trying to feel my way through this. To free itself from sanctions, Rusal fielded a team of high-paid lobbyists for an intense months-long effort in Washington, One of the targets was Kentucky's own Mitch McConnell. And now we get down to his role in all of this. Kentucky's own Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, who helped thwart a bipartisan push, just coincidentally apparently, to keep the sanctions in place. Since May, two of McConnell's former staffers have lobbied Congress on behalf of Brady, according to the filings. We didn't learn that one yesterday. Ahead of the 2018 midterm elections, one of Rusal's longtime major shareholders, Len Blavatnik, we've heard that name before, contributed more than $1 million through his companies to a GOP campaign fund tied to McConnell. Deripaska denies he has interest in meddling in U.S. affairs. And why would he have that interest? That's Putin's interest. Sometimes I serve his interest, sometimes I don't, whatever. Or maybe it's just an unspoken agreement, or maybe I just am pro-Russia because I'm Russian. We don't know. Anyway, he denies having an interest in meddling in U.S. affairs. If they didn't touch me, I wouldn't have to be so interested in U.S. politics, which actually sounds like the opposite, doesn't it? Deripaska told Time in February after attending a panel with U.S. lawmakers in Munich. But here I am, he added with a smile. Backers of the deal say its critics are playing politics or being paranoid. The U.S. benefits from economic ties to foreign powers, they say, as long as everyone plays by our rules. McConnell, who declined an interview with Time, told reporters in May that his position on Rusal was completely unrelated to anything that might happen in my home state. Blavatnik's company, Access Industries, told Time his donations to both Democrats and Republicans over the years were driven, quote, only by a desire to further a pro-business, pro-Israel agenda, not a pro-Russia one. And I'm not sure that makes it any better, but okay. Rusal says its motives are purely financial. Rusal keeps out of politics in all its markets. Oh, yeah, of course. The company told Time. Industry experts agree that apart from any political dividends, the plant in Kentucky will likely reap significant profits for its owners. Since taking office, President Donald Trump's administration has tightened the rules on foreign investments that could pose a threat to national security. You think? Is that based on anything, do you think? I'm not sure. But in Ashland, as at the White House, few people want to see the deal undone. In the hilly towns around Ashland and Greenup, the nexus between Rusal, Brady, and national security matters little next to the jobs the deal would bring. Some 11,000 people have already applied to work at the future mill, according to Brady. Do we think that's true? That's another thing. It's easy to believe, but it's also easy to believe that people involved in anything even remotely connected to Trump might be lying like crazy. We don't know. In the end, one of the lessons of the pact may be that the U.S. has its hands tied when it comes to this brand of Russian influence. Fighting back would cost jobs that Americans need. Deripaska, who personally remains under sanctions, is glad to point out the dilemma, as he put it to Time in February, by hitting us, you hit yourselves. Back when Bouchard and Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin broke ground in June of 2018, they shared a bottle of Korbel and plenty of optimism. That October, Trump touted the new aluminum mill at a rally at Eastern Kentucky University, heralding it as a symbol of blue-collar revival. Back in Ashland, locals praised Bouchard's commitment to the region, pointing to his investments in scholarships and promising playground equipment for local schools. In an area struggling with the twin crises of job loss and the opioid epidemic, the tall, genial CEO with a contagious grin has embraced an image of economic savior. When he walks around Ashland, Bouchard says, middle-aged women will just come up to me crying and hug me. That sounds awfully Trumpian, doesn't it? Some in the region literally banked their future on the mill. More than 100 people, many of them middle-aged workers laid off from local steel and railroad companies, shelled out $15,000 for a 2-year degree at Brady-partnered community college, spurred by the prospect of a job at the new plant. You can finally see the gleam of hope in people's eyes, says Judge Executive Robert Carpenter, the top elected official in Greenup County. I go to sleep every night with a smile on my face about it. But by late fall 2018, doubt had crept in. At the plant's future site, fading Brady-driven banners, that's what it says, from the groundbreaking were the only sign of the economic renaissance Bouchard promised. Company filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission showed that Brady was still hundreds of millions of dollars short. Yeah, I thought they might be. Local newspapers began to question the project. Bouchard's Facebook page became a community message board of sorts where hundreds of commenters divided themselves into cheerleaders or naysayers who pressed him for answers. A lot of people in this area had lost hope, recalls Justin Turner, a 26-year-old father of two who enrolled in the community college program in hopes of landing a job at Brady. Bouchard felt the pressure. He grew desperate enough to accept help from just about anyone, he told Time. If they're running a whorehouse, I wouldn't say yes, he says, but literally any upstanding businessman from any country, any nationality, any religion, I'd welcome them. Help me rebuild Appalachia. It's not that Bouchard didn't know the risks involved in working with Russian billionaires. In 2008, he and his younger brother Jim sold their U.S. steel assets to a firm controlled by Alexei Mordashov, a Russian metals tycoon, in a transaction valued at around $775 million at the time. While the deal helped them make them wealthy, it also deepened Bouchard's concern over the role of Russian oligarchs in strategic U.S. industries. The next year, he co-authored a book titled America for Sale, which warned that foreign investors pose a threat to America's economic and national security. And we'll explore that threat when we come back after this. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, I hope we timed that break sufficiently. It's difficult to do sometimes when we're taping off the air live. Anyway, did you catch that? Just to recap, as we were headed into the break, it was a little bit confusing as I was reading it. But yeah, I'll reiterate by reading this paragraph again. It's not that Bouchard didn't know the risks involved in working with Russian billionaires. In 2008, he and his younger brother Jim sold their U.S. steel assets to a firm controlled by Alexei Mordashov, a Russian metals tycoon, which is it's who they're dealing with now. Deripaska is a Russian metals tycoon, in a transaction valued at around $775 million at the time, which almost sounds like he could probably revitalize a lot of Appalachia himself, but whatever. While the deal helped make them wealthy, it also deepened Bouchard's concern over the role of Russian oligarchs in strategic U.S. industries. The next year, he co-authored a book titled America for Sale, which warned that foreign investors pose a threat to America's economic and national security. Interesting, right? Because he now proposes to do the same thing. And here's a quote from the book, I guess. If Putin harbors a nasty wish to throw a wrench into the works of the U.S. economy, then he now has acquired the means to do so, Bouchard wrote. When it comes to industries vital to defense like steel and aluminum, the bottom line is that we believe it is risky business to trust Russian oligarchs, the book concluded. 10 years on, Bouchard's warning, looms over the deal he cut in Kentucky. As Europe's largest aluminum producer, Rusal employs over 60,000 people in 13 countries. The company is indispensable, says Jorge Vasquez, head of Harbor Aluminum, a market intelligence firm. Rusal even had a green story to tell. Its smelters in Siberia run on hydropower, so it pollutes less than most rivals. But the company has a troubled past. Oh my. Almost worthy of dramatic music, but not quite. In the 1990s, an array of mobsters, that is bad, oligarchs and corrupt officials fought a bloody turf war for control of the aluminum assets privatized by the Russian state. Deripaska emerged from the struggle victorious, which means nothing. It was just a fight between mobsters, oligarchs, and corrupt officials that he won. He won because of his virtue. Still in his early 30s, he managed to consolidate Russia's key aluminum assets and form Rusal in 2000. He developed close ties with the Kremlin, becoming a more or less permanent fixture on Putin's trips abroad, a 2006 U.S. Embassy cable reported. The cable, as we learned yesterday, later published by WikiLeaks, describes Deripaska as among the 2 or 3 oligarchs Putin turns to on a regular basis. As his empire grew, Deripaska enlisted U.S. lobbyists to support his interests. Among them was GOP political operator Paul Manafort, who offered Deripaska a lobbying strategy that he said would benefit the Putin government. According to the Mueller report, why would he want to benefit the Putin government when his client is a private businessman? Well, lines are blurred there. Manafort and Deripaska, of course, fell out in 2009 over unpaid debts. But in the summer of 2016, Manafort became the chairman of the Trump campaign. He owed us a lot of money, one of Deripaska's close aides, the former Russian intelligence officer Viktor Boyarkin, told Time in 2018, and he was offering to pay it back. Through intermediaries, Manafort sent Deripaska internal polling data and offered private briefings about the campaign, according to Mueller. As the special counsel investigated their relationship, the Treasury Department announced sanctions against Deripaska and Rusal in April 2018. In explaining the decision to sanction Deripaska, the Treasury Department cited allegations that he had, among other alleged offenses, bribed a government official, ordered the murder of a businessman, and had links to a Russian organized crime group. Deripaska denied these accusations as groundless, ridiculous, and absurd. In a lawsuit filed in March in the District of Columbia, he accused the Treasury Department of irrationality for relying on such claims, which his lawyers said originate from decades-old defamatory attacks by Deripaska's business competitors. Decades old. He's like 40. But okay. There's room for 2 decades there. By the way, Deripaska's business competitors, mobsters, oligarchs, and corrupt officials. So, whatever. The announcement of sanctions sent ripples through the global economy. As companies scrambled to find new suppliers, aluminum prices surged 12% in a week, the largest increase since the 1980s. Deripaska claims he lost more than 80% of his net worth, or around $7.5 billion. The ensuing turmoil in the metals market helped Rusal fight back as major corporations and European governments urged the U.S. to ease sanctions on the firm. The U.S. government had some leverage, but Deripaska had leverage too, says Joshua Kirschenbaum, a former sanctions official at the Treasury Department. It turned into a game of chicken. The man in charge of lobbying against the sanctions was Lord Gregory Barker of Battle, a British aristocrat. Even while serving in the House of Lords, Barker had agreed in 2017 to chair Deripaska's conglomerate. Soon, it fell to the former UK Minister for Energy and Climate Change to draft a strategy to free Rusal from sanctions by distancing the company from its owner. Dubbed the Barker Plan, it enlisted the bipartisan U.S. lobbying firm Mercury Public Affairs to help win over Washington at a fee of $108,500 per month, according to filings. Mercury handed the assignment to a team of D.C. insiders that included former GOP Senator David Vitter and former Trump campaign aide Brian Lanza. Barker Lanza and Vitter declined interview requests from Time, by the way. In marathon talks with the Treasury Department, the lobbyists argued that the U.S. had made a mistake in going after Rusal. Former Treasury officials say. Allies in Europe agreed. Ambassadors from Germany, France, the UK, and other EU states urged U.S. officials to ease the sanctions on Rusal and its parent company. They argued in a January 2019 letter to Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer that the livelihoods of 75,000 workers across the European Union depend on it. The sanctions hurt everyone, Deripaska wrote in an email to Time on August 13th. They probably do. That's the point. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin came around to this logic. Ahead of G20 meetings in July of 2018, he told Reuters the goal was not to put Rusal out of business. So Rusal dangled a deal, offering to permanently remove Deripaska's control over the firm by lowering his ownership stake to less than 50%, according to documents reviewed by Time. After some discussions, Deripaska's stake in Rusal's parent company was reduced from 70% to 45%, with some of the difference going to family members and professional associates, which is to say, they didn't go anywhere. A few days before Christmas, the Trump administration announced it intended to lift the sanctions. To some experts, it was a logical end to the face-off. It was a reasonable deal, says Brian O'Toole, a former sanctions expert at the Treasury Department under President Obama, because the collateral damage of keeping that company under sanctions was so dramatic. Under the deal to lift sanctions on Rusal, Deripaska, his family, and his close associates are also barred from using their shares to influence the company or to benefit from it. Enforced by what? We don't really know. But opponents of the deal say it's laughable to believe Deripaska's influence is really gone. Ownership is the wrong test, says Senator Mark Warner, a Virginia Democrat, arguing Deripaska maintains influence over Rusal. Led by Schumer, senators from both parties moved to block Treasury from lifting the sanctions. Yet Rusal had a powerful ally in McConnell who backed Treasury's move. In recent weeks, McConnell has been taunted by protesters in Washington, on social media, and back home who have labeled him Moscow Mitch for his refusal to bring election security legislation to a vote. It's a moniker that stuck in Kentucky, where Democrats started selling Just Say Niet to Moscow Mitch merchandise, including Cossack hats. McConnell has slammed critics in the media for modern-day McCarthyism and says his record proves he has been tough on Russia. Critics also seized on McConnell's links to Blavatnik, a dual U.S. and UK citizen who was one of Rusal's biggest shareholders. Born in the Soviet Union and naturalized in the U.S. in 1984, Blavatnik earned most of his fortune, estimated by Forbes at $16.5 billion, as a partner to Deripaska and other Russian oil and metals tycoons. Blavatnik's family has donated to both Republicans and Democrats, but in recent years his companies have been especially generous toward the GOP. Those contributions have since included a total of $3.5 million to the Senate Leadership Fund, a super PAC run by McConnell's former chief of staff, according to FEC data. The money helped Republicans keep control of the Senate in the 2018 elections, securing McConnell's perch as the majority leader. In a floor speech on January 15th, McConnell insisted the deal with Treasury would continue limiting Deripaska's influence over Rusal and noted that Treasury can reimpose sanctions at any time. The Senate vote on Rusal came the next day. 11 GOP senators joined 46 Democrats in voting to uphold the sanctions, but it wasn't enough. The critics needed a 60-vote supermajority to override the Trump administration. They actually needed it to override the threatened filibuster to get cloture so they could get a finalized vote. Overriding the Trump administration, a veto would, of course, require 67 votes. But they fell short by 3 votes, 2 of which were cast by McConnell and Kentucky's Republican junior Senator Rand Paul. Following day, 136 House Republicans broke ranks and joined House Democrats to oppose lifting the sanctions, a rare but symbolic rebuke. I'm wondering, this doesn't lay it out, and neither did the other article, but maybe it was, in fact, that they were attempting to override a veto, but still that would be 67 and not 60 votes. At any rate, 10 days later, the sanctions on Rusal were formally lifted. 11 weeks after that, Rusal announced its deal with Brady. A month after the sanctions were lifted, one of Rusal's U.S.-based executives, Andrei Donets, arrived in Ashland with 3 of his colleagues. They spent 2 days discussing strategies, touring schools, dining at the local country club, and meeting community leaders. At the end of their trip, Bochard pulled out some Kentucky bourbon, poured it into plastic cups because he's so rich, and raised a toast. In what we do, you dream big, he recalls telling his new partners, or you go home. So inspirational. Bochard remains buoyant about the deal. In interviews with Time, he said the U.S. has nothing to worry about, despite his book, I guess. The new aluminum plant will serve civilian customers, car makers, and food and beverage industry, he claims. A company website says its aluminum alloys could have military applications in the future. I don't see why they couldn't have it right now, but few in Kentucky are focused on geostrategic concerns. Rusal is a company. It's not a country, says Carpenter, the judge executive in Greenup County. Remember him? That kind of an investment, I don't care who it's with. Except, of course, again, the lines are blurred in Russia, as between countries and companies, governments and oligarchs, mobsters and officials, for that matter. But not everyone in Kentucky was excited about the Russians' arrival. After Donet's visit, a red billboard funded by a liberal group was erected on a busy stretch of I-75. Russian mob money. Really, Mitch? The only reason Oleg is here is because Mitch McConnell opened the gate, says Representative Kelly Flood, a Democrat from Lexington. We are now all aligned with this criminal. The deal created unease among some Republicans, too. I would not have taken the Russian money, James Comer, the GOP congressman representing Kentucky's 1st District, said on the day the partnership was announced. Yet even critics of the deal were leery of the fallout from killing it. In 2017, Governor Bevin had cut an unusual agreement in which the state directly invested $15 million in the new aluminum mill. At least 750 investors, most from Kentucky, put in money as part of the crowdfunding portion of Brady's common stock offering, Bochard said. In effect, Kentucky taxpayers were partners in the project. To pull out as a state now is to pull out on the people of Ashland, says Flood. Other Western democracies have learned that such bonds can carry consequences. Ooh, bonds. It's an interesting way of putting it. They don't mean financial in the sense of a financial instrument, but actually that's worth thinking about too. Oligarch-owned companies have helped the Kremlin influence politics across Europe. Since Putin came to power in 2000, Russia has used economic leverage to force a change in policy or undermine governments in at least 19 European countries. Laura Rosenberger, a former National Security Council official under Obama, told a House committee last May. On rare occasions, Russian oligarchs have even described how this strategy works. Thank you for telling us. I appreciate knowing. What is a factory in a one-factory town? It's what all life revolves around. The billionaire Dmitry Firtash, a longtime ally of the Kremlin in Ukraine, told Time in a 2017 interview, "We don't just pay wages, we provide the social safety net. So people believe us. When he and his factories put their support behind a political cause or candidate, that influences people," Firtash explains. That's what ensures electoral support. We're no strangers to that here in the United States either, of course. Only in the context of the Mueller investigation have U.S. policymakers begun to worry whether the tools of economic influence that Russia honed in Europe could work just as well on American politics. Of course, we have that secret recording of the old House Republican leadership saying exactly that and acknowledging it, but okay, whatever. Russia's direct investments in the U.S. amounted to less than $4 billion in 2018, a relatively minor sum, although its billionaires have long had an outsized presence in some industries, including the tech sector. The Obama administration was slow in general to recognize the problem, said Freed, the former State Department official. We've come to realize we're not so special in that regard. We're just targets like everybody else. The fight is not over in Washington. Treasury needs to take potential harm to national security from Rusol's proposed investment seriously. Oregon Senator Ron Wyden, the top Democrat on the Senate Committee on Finance, said in an August 11th statement to Time. Wyden has been pushing for a review of the deal. Other Democrats say if Rusol is banking on its investment in American jobs to protect it from future sanctions, that highlights a bigger problem. The situation with Rusol broadly raises concerns that entities may in effect be too big to sanction, given the interconnectedness of the global economy, says a Senate Democratic aide. It's not as if the U.S. has no protections against malign foreign investment, but thanks to a regulatory loophole, the Rusol-Brady deal skated past the agency that vets foreign investments for threats to national security. Remember these guys? According to the mandate of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, the agency does not investigate so-called greenfield projects, which are built from the ground up, and brand new plants like the one in Ashland might just fit through that loophole, says Ayman Mir, who ran the agency for 4 years until 2018. As a general rule, he tells Time, the agency tries to keep the U.S. as open as possible to legitimate foreign capital. All other things being equal, Mir says, we should be welcoming of investment. Say, what kind of name is Ayman Mir? A-I-M-E-N, Mir, M-I-R. Anyway, that attitude has begun to shift under the Trump administration. Though legislation passed last summer, or rather through legislation passed last summer, CFIUS will get expanded powers to collect data on foreign investments and block the ones it deems to be a threat. In April, the agency pressured the Russian billionaire Mikhail Friedman to sell his fund's stake in a U.S. cybersecurity firm, Cofense Incorporated. Those powers may soon be tested because there are signs Rusol is not done investing in the U.S. Soon after the Kentucky deal was announced, Lord Barker sent a letter to the governors of 8 more U.S. states. In the April 18th note, he touted the benefits of the Rusol investment and said the company was eager to evaluate other opportunities around the country and your state in particular. To 8 of them. Okay. To critics of Russian economic influence, the letter sounded one particularly ominous chord. Quote, as part of our international growth strategy, we see significant opportunities across the whole industry value chain in North America, Barker wrote. The investment in Kentucky, he added, is just the beginning of our long-term ambitions. And I guess we'll find out more about what those long-term ambitions are in the not-too-distant future, because it looks like we are irrevocably hooked in to the Russian oligarch economy. And can't wait until they're able to pull the plug on large sectors of American jobs at will. Should be only good coming out of that for American national security. So that, I think, will close the books on this particular chapter of weird ways that foreign governments are able to influence American politics. And now we move on to a different one, a perhaps more... one we've been discussing for a little bit longer and which can become a theme. I've got a couple of articles here which might take us the rest of the show and maybe more to read all the way through. But I thought we might pay some attention to an article that we were hinting at earlier in the week. The New York Times look at how YouTube radicalized Brazil alongside another New York Times item about the global machine behind the rise of far-right nationalism. And I think they probably go hand in hand. And I don't know, which one should we start with first? Well, how about the YouTube radicalizing Brazil? This was one we wanted to... Oh, really one I actually need to read to my kids at some point. They're so YouTube addicted, and it's difficult to always to know exactly what it is they're watching, that we try and keep a close eye on things. All right, we'll start with this for my own good. Max Fisher and Amanda Taub teaming up on this August 11th piece. from out of Brazil, and you'll have to excuse me for trying to pronounce Brazilian town names. Where are we here? Niterói, Niteroi, with the accent over the O. You know what? As a matter of fact, we can pause for just a second since we're not live and actually check the pronunciation, although that's not a habit I want to get into very often. Okay, I am assured by my internet search that it is Niterói, Brazil. When Mateus Domingues was 16, YouTube recommended a video that changed his life. He was in a band in Niterói, a beach-ringed city in Brazil, I guess we should say, and practiced guitar by watching tutorials online. Sounds familiar. YouTube had recently installed a powerful new artificial intelligence system that learned from user behavior and paired videos with recommendations for others. One day, it directed him to an amateur guitar teacher named Nando Moura, who had gained a wide following by posting videos about heavy metal, video games, and most of all, politics. Oh dear. In colorful and paranoid far-right rants, Mr. Moura, it's M-O-U-R-A, accused feminists, teachers, and mainstream politicians of waging vast conspiracies. Mr. Domingues was hooked. As his time on the site grew, YouTube recommended videos from other far-right figures. One was a lawmaker named Jair Bolsonaro, then a marginal figure in national politics, but a star in YouTube's far-right community in Brazil, where the platform has become more widely watched than all but one TV channel. Last year, he became President Bolsonaro. YouTube became the social media platform of the Brazilian right, said Mr. Domingues, now a lanky 17-year-old who says he too plans to seek political office. Members of the nation's newly empowered far right, from grassroots organizers to federal lawmakers, say their movement would not have risen so far so fast without YouTube's recommendation engine. New research has found they may be correct. YouTube's search and recommendation system appears to have systematically diverted users to far-right and conspiracy channels in Brazil. A New York Times investigation in Brazil found that time and again, videos promoted by the site have upended central elements of daily life. Teachers describe classrooms made unruly by students who quote from YouTube conspiracy videos, or who, encouraged by right-wing YouTube stars, secretly record their instructors. Some parents look to Dr. YouTube for health advice, but get dangerous misinformation instead, hampering the nation's efforts to fight diseases like Zika. Viral videos, no pun intended there, have incited death threats against public health advocates. And in politics, a wave of right-wing YouTube stars ran for office alongside Mr. Bolsonaro, some winning by historic margins. Most still use the platform, governing the world's fourth largest democracy, good thing to remember, through internet-honed trolling and provocation. YouTube's recommendation system is engineered to maximize watch time, among other factors, the company says, but not to favor any political ideology. The system suggests what to watch next, often playing the videos automatically in a never-ending quest to keep us glued to our screens. But the emotions that draw people in, like fear, doubt, and anger, are often central features of conspiracy theories, and in particular, experts say, of right-wing extremism. As the system suggests more provocative videos to keep users watching, it can direct them toward extreme content they might otherwise never find. And it is designed to lead users to new topics to pique new interests, a boon for channels like Mr. Moura's that use pop culture as a gateway to far-right ideas. The system now drives 70% of total time on the platform, the company says. As viewership skyrockets globally, YouTube is bringing in over $1 billion a month, some analysts believe. Zeynep Tufekci, a social media scholar whose name I'm almost certainly butchering, has called it one of the most powerful radicalizing instruments of the 21st century. It would have been, I'm sure, extremely powerful in the 20th century, and it was there, but okay. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's all 21st century. Never mind. Okay, just trying to cover up for an error in reading there. Company representatives disputed the study's methodology and said that the platform's systems do not privilege any one viewpoint or direct users toward extremism. However, company representatives conceded some of the findings and promised to make changes. I'm sure that, well, I'd be willing to believe that they didn't do it on purpose to point to right-wing content. But you can see, I think the Times writers here do a good job in explaining just how it might have coincidentally aligned itself with precisely that kind of content without knowing it. All right, back to the article. Farshad Shadlu, a spokesman, said that YouTube has invested heavily in the policies, resources, and products to reduce the spread of harmful misinformation, adding, "We've seen that authoritative content is thriving in Brazil and is some of the most recommended content on the site," despite what we're finding here. Dana Boyd, D-A-N-A-H, founder of the think tank Data and Society, attributed the disruption in Brazil to YouTube's unrelenting push for viewer engagement and the revenues it generates. Though corruption scandals and a deep recession had already devastated Brazil's political establishment and left many Brazilians ready for a break with the status quo, Ms. Boyd called YouTube's impact a worrying indication of the platform's growing impact on democracies worldwide. "This is happening everywhere," she said. Mauricio Martins, the local vice president of Mr. Bolsonaro's party in Niterói, credited most of the party's recruitment to YouTube, including his own. We'll be back in just a minute, and hopefully remember once we're back to do the Brazilian pronunciation, the Portuguese, not the French. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Okay, we left off just in starting a new section of the piece here. The actual section is called The Party of YouTube, where we learned that Mauricio Martins, the local vice president of Mr. Bolsonaro's party in Niterói, credited most of the party's recruitment to YouTube, including his own. He was killing time on the site one day, he recalled, when the platform showed him a video by a right-wing blogger. He watched out of curiosity. He showed him another, and then another. "Before that, I didn't have an ideological political background," Mr. Martins, or more likely Martins, said. "YouTube's auto-playing recommendations," he declared, "were my political education." Yikes. "It was like that with everyone," he said. The platform's political influence is increasingly felt in Brazilian schools. "Sometimes I'm watching videos about a game, and all of a sudden, it's a Bolsonaro video," said Inzaghi D, a 17-year-old high schooler in Niterói. These names are new on me here. Inzaghi, it's I-N-Z-A-G-H-I, and then I guess D, they're not identifying him because he's a minor. More and more, his fellow students are making extremist claims, often citing as evidence YouTube stars like Mr. Maura, the guitarist turned conspiracist. "It's the main source that kids have to get information," he said. Few illustrate YouTube's influence better than Carlos Jordi. Muscle-bound and heavily tattooed, his left hand bears a flaming skull with diamond eyes, which tells you a great deal about his educational, intellectual background. Everyone loves flaming skulls, and especially the diamond eyes, I think, is something you do when, like, from Phi Beta Kappa. He joined the city council in 2017 with few prospects of rising through traditional politics. So Mr. Jordi took inspiration from bloggers like Mr. Maura, or Moura, still working on that pronunciation, and his political mentor, Mr. Bolsonaro, turning his focus to YouTube. He posted videos accusing local teachers of conspiring to indoctrinate students into communism. The videos won him a national audience, he said, and propelled his stunning rise only 2 years later to the federal legislature. "If social media didn't exist, I wouldn't be here," he said. "Jair Bolsonaro wouldn't be president." I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Next up, down the rabbit hole. A few hundred miles away from Niterói, a team of researchers led by Virgilio Almeida at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. Good Lord. I'm going to get that one right. So Minas, M-I-N-A-S. I'm guessing Gerais. Gerais. Well, Virgilio here was hunched over computers trying to understand how YouTube shapes its users' reality. The team analyzed transcripts from thousands of videos as well as the comments beneath them. Right-wing channels in Brazil, they found, had seen their audiences expand far faster than others did, and seemed to be tilting the site's overall political content. In the months after YouTube changed its algorithm, positive mentions of Mr. Bolsonaro ballooned. So did mentions of conspiracy theories that he had floated. This began as polls still showed him to be deeply unpopular, suggesting that the platform was doing more than merely reflecting political trends. The team at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center set out to test whether the Brazilian far-right's meteoric rise on the platform had been boosted by YouTube's recommendation engine. Jonas Kaiser and Yasodhara Cordova, with Adrian Rauschfleisch of National Taiwan University, programmed a Brazil-based server to enter a popular channel or search term, then open YouTube's top recommendations, then follow the recommendations on each of those, and so on. By repeating this thousands of times, the researchers tracked how the platform moved users from one video to the next. They found that after users watched a video about politics or even entertainment, YouTube's recommendations often favored right-wing conspiracy-filled channels like Mr. Maura's. Crucially, users who watched one far-right channel would often be shown many more. The algorithm had united once marginal channels and then built an audience for them, the researchers concluded. One of those channels belonged to Mr. Bolsonaro, who had long used the platform to post hoaxes and conspiracies. Though a YouTube early adopter, his online following had done little to expand his political base, which barely existed on a national level. Then, Brazil's political system collapsed, just as YouTube's popularity there soared. Mr. Bolsonaro's views had not changed, but YouTube's far right, where he was a major figure, saw its audience explode, helping to prime large numbers of Brazilians for his message at a time when the country was ripe for a political shift. YouTube challenged the researchers' methodology and said its internal data contradicted their findings, but the company declined the Times' request for that data, as well as requests for certain statistics that would reveal whether or not the researchers' findings were accurate. Next up, Dr. YouTube. That in quotes, of course. The conspiracies were not limited to politics. Many Brazilians searching YouTube for healthcare information found videos that terrified them. Some said Zika was being spread by vaccines or by the insecticides meant to curb the spread of the mosquito-borne disease that has ravaged northeastern Brazil. The videos appeared to rise on the platform in much the same way as extremist political content, by making alarming claims and promising forbidden truths that kept users glued to their screens. Doctors, social workers, and former government officials said the videos had created the foundation of a public health crisis as frightened patients refused vaccines and even anti-Zika insecticides. The consequences have been pronounced in poorer communities like Maceió. I'm guessing again. Maceio. Maceió. That's my best guess at that one. A city in the Brazilian Northeast that was among the hardest hit by Zika. Fake news is a virtual war, said Flavio Santana, a pediatric neurologist based in Maceió. We have it coming from every direction. When Zika first spread in 2015, health workers distributed larvicides that killed the mosquitoes that spread the disease. Not long after YouTube installed its new recommendation engine, Dr. Santana's patients began telling him they'd seen videos blaming Zika on vaccines and later on larvicides. Many refused both. Dr. Auriane Oliveira, an infectious disease specialist at the same hospital, said patients increasingly defied her advice, including on procedures crucial to their child's survival. They said, "Nope, I've researched it on Google. I've seen it on YouTube," she said. Medical providers, she said, were competing every single day against Dr. Google and Dr. YouTube, and they were losing. Marjane Nunes, it's Mardjane, Marjane Nunes, a Zika expert who recently left a senior role in the health ministry, said that health workers across Brazil have been reporting similar experiences. As more communities refuse the anti-Zika larvicide, she added, the disease is seeing a small resurgence. Social media is winning, she said. Brazil's medical community had reason to feel outmatched. The Harvard researchers found that YouTube's systems frequently directed users who searched for information on Zika, or even those who watched a reputable video on health issues, toward conspiracy channels. A spokesman for YouTube confirmed the Times' findings, calling them unintended, and said the company would change how its search tool surfaced videos related to Zika. Next up, an ecosystem of hate. As the far right rose, many of its leading voices had learned to weaponize the conspiracy videos, offering their vast audiences a target, people to blame. Eventually, the YouTube conspiracists turned their spotlight on Deborah Diniz, a women's rights activist whose abortion advocacy had long made her a target on the far right, Bernardo Custer, a YouTube star whose homemade rants had won him 750,000 subscribers and an endorsement from Mr. Bolsonaro, accused her of involvement in the supposed Zika plots. The very people working to help families affected by Zika, their videos implied, were behind the disease. Backed by shadowy foreigners, their goal was to abolish Brazil's abortion ban, or even make abortions mandatory. As far-right and conspiracy channels began citing one another, YouTube's recommendation system learned to string their videos together. However implausible any individual rumor might be on its own, joined together they created the impression that dozens of disparate sources were revealing the same terrifying truth. It feels like the connection is made by the viewer, but the connection is made by the system, Ms. Diniz said. Threats of rape and torture filled Ms. Deniz's phone and email. Some cited her daily routines. Many echoed claims from Mr. Custer's videos, she said. Mr. Custer gleefully mentioned, though never explicitly endorsed, the threats. That kept him just within YouTube's rules. When the university where Ms. Diniz taught received a warning that a gunman would shoot her and her students, and the police said they could no longer guarantee her safety, she left Brazil. The YouTube system of recommending the next video and the next video, she said, had created an ecosystem of hate. I heard here that she's an enemy of Brazil. I hear in the next one that feminists are changing family values. And the next one I hear that they receive money from abroad, she said. That loop is what leads someone to say, I will do what has to be done. We need the companies to face their role, Ms. Diniz said. Ethically, they are responsible. As conspiracies spread on YouTube, video makers targeted aid groups whose work touches on controversial issues like abortion. Even some families that had long relied on such groups came to wonder if the videos might be true and began to avoid them. In Brazil, this is a growing online practice known as linchamento, lynching. Mr. Bolsonaro was an early pioneer, spreading videos in 2012 that falsely accused left-wing academics of plotting to force schools to distribute gay kits to convert children to homosexuality. My goodness. Mr. Jordi, his tattooed Niterói protege, was untroubled to learn that his own YouTube campaign accusing teachers of spreading communism had turned their lives upside down. One of those teachers, Valeria Borges, said she and her colleagues had been overwhelmed with messages of hate, creating a climate of fear. Mr. Jordi, far from disputing this, said it had been his goal. I wanted her to feel fear, he said. It's a culture war we're fighting, he explained. This is what I came into office to do. Wow. That's pretty frightening all by itself. Next up, the dictatorship of the like. Ground zero for politics by YouTube may be the Sao Paulo headquarters of Movimento Brasil Livre, which formed to agitate for the 2016 impeachment of the left-wing President Dilma Rousseff. Its members trend young, middle-class, right-wing, and extremely online. Renan Santos, the group's national coordinator, gestured to a door marked the YouTube division and said, "This is the heart of things." Inside, 8 young men poked at editing software. One was stylizing an image of Benito Mussolini for a video arguing that fascism had been wrongly blamed on the right. But even some people here fear the platform's impact on democracy. Mr. Santos, for example, called social media a weapon, adding that some people around Mr. Bolsonaro want to use this weapon to pressure institutions in a way that I don't see as responsible. The group's co-founder, a man-bunned former rock guitarist named Pedro de Eyrot, D''Eyrot, de Eyrot, I guess, said, "We have something here that we call the dictatorship of the like. Reality," he said, "is shaped by whatever message goes most viral." Even as he spoke, a 2-hour YouTube video was captivating the nation. Titled 1964, for the year of Brazil's military coup, it argued that the takeover had been necessary to save Brazil from communism. I'm sure that was an argument they made then, too. Mr. Dominguez, the teenager learning to play guitar, said the video persuaded him that his teachers had fabricated the horrors of military rule. Ms. Borges, the history teacher vilified on YouTube, said it brought back memories of military curfews, disappeared activists, and police beatings. "I don't think I've had my last beating," she said. Pretty scary, but still an abstraction, because we can at least say, well, it's happening in Brazil and not necessarily here, but of course the same search engine runs things here as runs it there, although I suppose they could tweak it as between different countries. But I don't know, same thing being reported here as well. Very well worth our time and maybe a good warning for the kids out there. As a matter of fact, I think somewhere parked in Pocket is a warning for English-speaking parents of YouTube teenagers as well. Let me see if I can grab that, if that makes some sense to follow up with. Okay, sticking with the New York Times for just a minute, or at least for, maybe 20 minutes. We'll see. One more story. This time, the global machine behind the rise of far-right nationalism, which may or may not give us time to lead into yet another story that maybe we'll carry over for another day. This, Joe Becker behind this piece from August 10th. The New Nativists is the sort of a title of the, it's not the title of the article, but rides above the title here. The New Nativists, the global machine behind the rise of far-right nationalism. Subheader, it's about Sweden. Sweden was long seen as a progressive utopia. Then came waves of immigrants and the forces of populism at home and abroad. So it reminds me a little bit of the situation in Brazil, that they elected a left-wing head of state and then suddenly swing right this time, apparently at the hands of right-wing YouTubers. Here, I'm not so sure whether YouTube plays a role or not, but another of the horror stories of European so-called populism, swinging things in the other direction. Based here in Rinkeby, Sweden. I'm guessing again at the pronunciation, Rinkeby, Rinkeby, Sweden. Johnny Castillo is the person who leads off the story here. Johnny Castillo, a Peruvian-born neighborhood watchman in this district of Stockholm. All right, Peruvian immigrants into Sweden. Very interesting as a start. At any rate, Johnny Castillo still puzzles over the strange events that 2 years ago turned the central square of this predominantly immigrant community into a symbol of multiculturalism run amok. First came a now infamous comment by President Trump, naturally he would be at the start of this, suggesting that Sweden's history of welcoming refugees was at the root of a violent attack in Rinkeby the previous evening, even though nothing had actually happened. What could be more Trump than that, right? You look at what's happening last night in Sweden. Sweden! Who would believe this? Sweden! Mr. Trump told supporters at a rally on February 18th, 2017. They took in large numbers. They're having problems like they never thought possible. That construction is almost always a giveaway with him. Something about you never thought possible or like you've never seen before or whatever. The president's source, of course, Fox News, which had excerpted a short film promoting a dystopian view of Sweden as a victim of its asylum policies, with immigrant neighborhoods crime-ridden no-go zones, as they like to call them. But 2 days later, as Swedish officials were heaping bemused derision on Mr. Trump, something did, in fact, happen in Rinkeby. Several dozen masked men attacked police officers making a drug arrest, throwing rocks and setting cars ablaze. And it was right around that time, according to Mr. Castillo and 4 other witnesses, that Russian television crews showed up, offering to pay immigrant youths, quote, to make trouble in front of the cameras. They wanted to show that President Trump is right about Sweden, Mr. Castillo said, that people coming to Europe are terrorists and want to disturb society. The nativist rhetoric that immigrants are invading the homeland has gained ever greater traction and political acceptance across the West amid dislocations wrought by vast waves of migration from the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. In its most extreme form, it is echoed in the online manifesto of the man accused of gunning down 22 people last weekend in El Paso. Now, elsewhere, we have seen them use the term screed rather than manifesto, but not here. In the nationalists' message-making, Sweden has become a prime cautionary tale, dripping with schadenfreude. What's even more striking is how many people in Sweden, progressive, egalitarian, welcoming Sweden, can you believe it? Sweden, how many of them seem to be warming to the nationalists' view that immigration has brought crime, chaos, and a fraying of the cherished social safety net, not to mention a withering away of national culture and tradition. You see, it's a threat to socialism, but they don't like to express it that way, I guess. Fueled by an immigration backlash, Sweden has accepted more refugees per capita than any other European country. Right-wing populism has taken hold, reflected most prominently in the steady ascent of a political party with neo-Nazi roots, the Sweden Democrats. In elections last year, they captured nearly 18% of the vote. I don't know whether that's a new party or a new name for the party or anything like that. Of course, I expect that you'll see right-wingers here in the United States have a field day with that. Well, see, Sweden Democrats, and in Sweden, the Democrats are the neo-Nazi party. Well, that's the same here. They're the real racists. Probably not even an accident. Anyway, I don't know what the history of the party is. Maybe I'll look that up and dissuade myself of that conspiracy theory. To dig beneath the surface of what's happening in Sweden, though, is to uncover the workings of an international disinformation machine devoted to the cultivation, provocation, and amplification of far-right, anti-immigrant passions and political forces. Indeed, that machine, most influentially rooted in Vladimir Putin's Russia and the American far-right, underscores a fundamental irony of this political movement, the globalization of nationalism. That is a little weird, isn't it? The central target of these manipulations from abroad and the chief instrument of the Swedish nationalists' success is the country's increasingly popular and virulently anti-immigrant digital echo chamber. It may not be YouTube, but something like it. A New York Times examination of its content, personnel, and traffic patterns illustrates how foreign state and non-state actors have helped to give viral momentum to a clutch of Swedish far-right websites. Russian and Western entities that traffic in disinformation, including an Islamophobic think tank whose former chairman is now Mr. Trump's national security advisor, have been crucial linkers to the Swedish sites, helping to spread their message to susceptible Swedes. They need to talk to the Finnish about how to combat this, right? Remember, we read that story. At least 6 Swedish sites have received financial backing through advertising revenue from a Russian and Ukrainian-owned auto parts business based in Berlin, whose online sales network, oddly, contains buried digital links to a range of far-right and other socially divisive content. Writers and editors for the Swedish sites have been befriended by the Kremlin, and in one strange Rube Goldbergian chain of events, a frequent German contributor to one Swedish site has been implicated in the financing of a bombing in Ukraine in a suspected Russian false flag operation. You got all of that? The distorted view of Sweden pumped out by this disinformation machine has been used, in turn, by anti-immigrant parties in Britain, Germany, Italy, and elsewhere to stir xenophobia and gin up votes, according to the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, a London-based nonprofit that tracks the online spread of far-right extremism. I'd put Sweden up there with the anti-Soros campaign, said Chloe Colliver, researcher for the Institute, referring to anti-Semitic attacks on George Soros, the billionaire benefactor of liberal causes. It's become an enduring centerpiece of the far-right conversation. Next section here, from margins to mainstream. Matthias Carlsson, the Sweden Democrats' international secretary and chief ideologist, likes to tell the story of how he became a soldier in what he has described as the existential battle, everything's existential these days, for our culture's and our nation's survival. It was the mid-1990s, and Mr. Carlsson, now 41, was attending high school in the southern city of Vaxjo. I'm going to guess that. V-A-X-J-O. You tell me how that's pronounced. We could stop everything and check, but we're not going to. Mr. Carlsson, who, by the way, didn't he later go on to own and manage WKRP in Cincinnati, or was that a different guy? I forget where Mr. Carlsson was from. Okay, anyway. Sweden, this Mr. Carlsson in Sweden. Sweden was accepting a record number of refugees from the Balkan War back in the mid-1990s and other conflicts in Vaxjo, again, a good guess, and elsewhere. Young immigrant men began joining brawling kicker gangs, that's what they were calling them, radicalizing Mr. Carlsson and drawing him toward the local skinhead scene. He took to wearing a leather jacket with a Swedish flag on the back. That doesn't sound all that intimidating, but, you know, they got their local toughs too, I guess. A leather jacket with a Swedish flag on the back, and was soon introduced to Mats Nilsson, a Swedish National Socialist leader, National Socialist, yes, who gave him a copy of Mein Kampf, of course. They began to debate. Debate me, right? You know how that goes. They began to debate. Mr. Nilsson argued that the goal should be ethnic purity, the preservation of, quote, Swedish DNA. They probably already screwed that up. But okay. Mr. Carlsson countered that the focus should be on preserving national culture and identity. That, he said, was when Mr. Nilsson conferred on him an epithet of insufficient commitment to the cause. Meatball patriot. Isn't that something? Meatball patriot. What a strange thing. Well, it explains here that it means that I thought that every African or Arab can come to this country as long as they assimilate and eat meatballs. That's how you would measure your Swedishness, I guess, in all of this. What an odd thing to settle on. I really would have thought that was more of a stereotype than anything, but maybe I guess the National Socialists aren't afraid of stereotypes there in Sweden. Okay, Meatball Patriot. Not my idea, their idea. So, all right, we'll continue with this story when we return after a 2-minute break. Very interesting. I guess here, really, I don't have enough time to fit in the next paragraph, so we're just killing time until the music takes us around to the 2-minute break, which is about right now. We'll be right back after this. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal. Except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Almost missed my cue with the mute button there. All right, so when we left off, we had gotten an explanation for why they called this guy a meatball patriot. Sounds kind of odd to me, but all right. At any rate, it is an account that offers the most benign explanation for an odious association. Whatever the case, in 1999, he joined the Sweden Democrats, a party undeniably rooted in Sweden's neo-Nazi movement. Indeed, scholars of the far right say that this is what sets it apart from most anti-immigration parties in Europe and makes its rise from marginalized to mainstream so remarkable. The party was founded in 1988, so there's our answer, by several Nazi ideologues, including a former member of the Waffen-SS, the actual genuine article, eh? What's he doing in Sweden? I don't know. Early on, it sought international alliances with the likes of the White Aryan Resistance, a white supremacist group founded by a former Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. Some Sweden Democrats wore Nazi uniforms to party functions. Its platform included the forced repatriation of all immigrants since 1970. Which is an interesting place to draw the line. My guess is that the former member of the Waffen-SS, now in the, or at that point then in the Sweden Democrats Party, was an immigrant, but probably immigrated before, about 1970 or so, I would guess. Very interesting. That was not, however, a winning formula in a country where social democrats have dominated every election for more than a century. While attending university, Mr. Carlson had met Jimmy Åkesson, maybe Akesson, Akesson, who took over the Sweden Democrats Youth Party in 2000 and became party leader in 2005. Mr. Akesson was outspoken in his belief that Muslim refugees posed the biggest foreign threat to Sweden since the Second World War. But to make that case effectively, he and Mr. Carlson agreed they needed to remake the party's image. We needed to really address our past, Mr. Carlson said. They purged neo-Nazis who had been exposed by the press. The hidden ones got to stay, I guess. They announced a zero-tolerance policy toward extreme xenophobia and racism, emphasized their youthful leadership, and urged members to dress presentably. One might even say in a dapper fashion, perhaps. And while immigration remained at the center of their platform, they moderated the way they talked about it. No longer was the issue framed in terms of keeping certain ethnic groups out or deporting those already in. Rather, it was about how unassimilated immigrants were eviscerating not just the nation's cultural identity, but also the social welfare heart of the Swedish state. So back to pro-socialist. Under the grand egalitarian idea of the Folkhemmet, no idea of the Swedish pronunciation there, or people's home, in which the country is a family and its citizens take care of one another, Swedes pay among the world's highest effective tax rates in return for benefits like childcare, healthcare, free college education, and assistance when they grow old. The safety net has come under strain for a host of economic and demographic reasons, many of which predate the latest refugee flood. But in the Sweden Democrats' telling, the blame lies squarely at the feet of the foreigners, many of whom lag far behind native Swedes in education and economic accomplishment. One party advertisement depicted a white woman trying to collect benefits while being pursued by niqab-wearing immigrants pushing strollers. To what extent the party's makeover is just window dressing is an open question. The doubts were highlighted in what became known as the Iron Pipe Scandal in 2012. Leaked video showed two Sweden Democrat MPs and the party's candidate for Attorney General hurling racist slurs at a comedian of Kurdish descent, then threatening a drunken witness with iron pipes. High-ranking party officials have bounced between Sweden and Hungary, of all places, ruled by the authoritarian nationalist Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Mr. Carlson himself has come under fire for calling out an extremist site as neo-fascist while using an alias to recommend posts as worth reading to party members. There's a public face and the face they wear behind closed doors, said Daniel Pohl, P-O-O-H-L, who heads Expo, a Stockholm-based foundation that tracks far-right extremism. Still, even detractors admit that the strategy has worked. In 2010, the Sweden Democrats captured 5.7% of the vote, enough for the party and Mr. Carlson to enter parliament for the first time. That share has steadily increased, along with the growing population of refugees. Today, roughly 20% of Sweden's population is foreign-born. At its peak in 2015, Sweden accepted 163,000 asylum seekers, mostly from Afghanistan, Somalia, and Syria. Though border controls and tighter rules have eased that flow, Ardalan Shekarabi, the country's public administration minister, acknowledged that his government had been slow to act. I imagine he is Middle Eastern in his origin as well. That's right in the name. Shekarabi? Okay. Mr. Shekarabi, an immigrant from Iran, there's your answer, said the sheer number of refugees had overwhelmed the government's efforts to integrate them. I absolutely don't think that the majority of Swedes have racist or xenophobic views, but they had questions about this migration policy, and the other parties didn't have any answers, he said, which is one of the reasons why Sweden Democrats had a case. Our next section here, a right-wing echo chamber. Sounds familiar, yes? As the 2018 elections approached, Swedish counterintelligence was on high alert for foreign interference. Russia, the hulking neighbor to the east, was seen as the main threat. After the Kremlin's meddling in the 2016 American election, Sweden had reason to fear it could be next. Russia's goal is to weaken Western countries by polarizing the debate, said Daniel Stenling, the Swedish Security Service's counterintelligence chief. For the last 5 years, we have seen more and more aggressive intelligence work against our nation. But as it turned out, there was no hacking and dumping of internal campaign documents, as in the United States, nor was there an overt effort to swing the election to the Sweden Democrats, perhaps because the party, in keeping with Swedish popular opinion, has become more critical of the Kremlin than some of its far-right European counterparts. Instead, security officials say, the foreign influence campaign took a different, more subtle form, helping nurture Sweden's rapidly evolving far-right digital ecosystem. For years, the Sweden Democrats had struggled to make their case to the public. Many mainstream media outlets declined their ads. The party even had difficulty getting the postal service to deliver its mailers. So it built a network of closed Facebook pages whose reach would ultimately exceed that of any other party. But to thrive in the viral sense, that network required fresh, alluring content. It drew on a clutch of relatively new websites whose popularity was exploding. Members of the Sweden Democrats helped create 2 of them. Oh boy, they're in Swedish, of course. Samhällsnytt. That's News in Society. Am I Swedish? I have zero pronunciation idea. And Nyheter Idag, News Today. So I guess that NYT or NY NY something is the basis of the news word here. By the 2018 election year, they, along with a site called Frida Tider, Free Times, or Tider maybe, were among Sweden's 10 most shared news sites. Maybe I actually will try and find out how these things are pronounced, just for fun. Okay, are you ready for this? The name of the town where Mr. Carlson went to high school, Vaxjo, is apparently pronounced Växjö, like that, Växjö. Although apparently I'm told that in northern Sweden they might say Växjö and put a sound in there for the J. But Växjö is my best pronunciation, copied off of what I found on the internet. And if you find it on the internet, it's bound to be true, or at least somewhere eventually. Anyway, then I realized I went and I had been careful about getting the pronunciation of these websites. There were no guides to how to pronounce them because they were proprietary names, not city names or personal names. And then I realized, why did I spend all that time on it? These are terrible, terrible websites. But I'll tell you what I learned anyway. The first one, News in Society, I guess is something along the lines of Samhällsnytt, something like that. The second one, News Today, would be about something like Nyheter Ida, or something like that. And then the Free Times, something along the lines of Fia Tider, I guess. Fia Tider is my best attempt at correct pronunciation of terrible Nazi right-wing websites. So I don't know why I spent that much time doing it, but I learned a little bit about Swedish pronunciation. It's not going to help me in the future, but I learned it and it went one ear and out the other. So, okay. Anyway, these 3 stupid websites now are among Sweden's 10 most shared news sites. They each reached 1/10 of all Swedish internet users. Can you believe that? Each week. And according to an Oxford University study, accounted for 85% of the election-related junk news, enclosed in quotes. They're deemed deliberately distorted or misleading that is shared online. There were other sites, too, all injecting anti-immigrant and Islamophobic messaging into the Swedish political bloodstream. Here's one, a recent headline that reads, Immigration behind shortage in drinking water in northern Stockholm. Another says, Refugee minor raped host family's daughter, thought it was legal. Read another, performed female genital mutilation on her children, given asylum in Sweden. Russia's hand in all of this is largely hidden from view, but fingerprints abound. For instance, one writer for Samhällsnytt, who previously worked for the Sweden Democrats, was recently declined parliamentary press accreditation after the security police determined he had been in contact with Russian intelligence. Fria Tider, is considered, what am I sorry for? Considered not only one of the most extreme sites, but also among the most Kremlin-friendly. So screw them. Frida Tider, as far as I'm concerned. It frequently swaps material with the Russian propaganda outlet Sputnik. The site is linked via domain ownership records to Granskning Sverige. That's something I should probably figure out. The Swedish troll factory for its efforts to entrap and embarrass mainstream journalists. Well, it's just entrapped and embarrassed me, but anyway, they're trolls, so who cares? Among its frequent targets, journalists who write negatively about Russia. How odd. We've had death threats, spam attacks, emails. This year has been totally crazy, said Eva Burman, the editor of, oh my goodness, another one. Let's see. Eskilstuna Kuriren, a newspaper that found itself in the crosshairs after criticizing the Russian annexation of Crimea and investigating Granskning Sverige itself. And that's like Swedish, and I don't even know why I can't pronounce that. Sverige. I have no idea. And no rules of Swedish pronunciation known to me. At the magazine Nyheter, the editor, Vavra Suk, which will, I guess since he's a lousy person, Vavra Suck. is how that would be pronounced in England or in America, has traveled to Moscow as an election observer. For what reason, I don't know. And to Syria, where he produced Kremlin-friendly accounts of the civil war. Nia Tidar has published work by Alexander Dugin, an ultranationalist Russian philosopher who has been called Putin's Rasputin. Mr. Suck's writing, because it sucks, for Mr. Dugin's think tank included one titled Donald Trump Can Make Europe Great Again. I have my doubts about that. Where are we in this one? Nia Tidar's contributors include Manuel Oceanreiter. How about that? Oceanreiter. Editor of Zurst, a German far-right newspaper. They're trying to kill me with pronunciations here. Mr. Oxenreiter, is my maybe a slightly better pronunciation, who has appeared regularly on RT, the Kremlin propaganda channel, worked until recently for Markus Frohnmayer, a member of the German Bundestag representing the far-right Alternative for Germany party. Documents leaked to a consortium of European media outlets, documents that Mr. Frohnmayer has called fake, have suggested that Moscow aided his election campaign in order to have an absolutely controlled MP. That's a quote. Mr. Oxenreiter, for his part, has been implicated in Polish court, they're all over the place, in the financing of a 2018 firebombing attack on a Hungarian cultural center in Ukraine. The plot, according to testimony from a Polish extremist charged with carrying it out, was designed to pin responsibility on Ukrainian nationalists and stoke ethnic tensions to Russia's benefit. Mr. Oxenreiter has not been charged in Poland, but prosecutors in Berlin said they had begun a preliminary investigation. He has denied involvement. Mr. Suk declined to comment. Then there is Nehater Idag. Its founder, Chang Frick. Really. A former Sweden Democrat official who takes a maverick's glee in his defiance of orthodoxy, readily admits to having contributed to an RT subsidiary. At a pizza shop near his home one afternoon, he pointedly noted that his girlfriend was Russian, and with a flourish pulled out a wad of rubles from a recent trip. "Here is my real boss. It's Putin," he laughed. But Mr. Frick, the son of a Swedish Roma and a Polish Jew, said Nehater, how do we pronounce this one again? Nehater Ida answered to no one, neither the Sweden Democrats nor the Kremlin, though he added that his relentless reporting about the problems posed by immigrants dovetailed with both their agendas. "People can see what's happening in the streets," he said, adding, "I've been accused of being a racist. I'm being paid by the Sweden Democrats. I'm a spy for Russia. That just tells me I'm kicking where it hurts." Still, he said he had reason to believe that there is a little bit of collusion between Russia and some Swedish right-wing media. One of his early scoops involved exposing the drinking and womanizing shenanigans of a Sweden Democrat member of parliament who had been invited to Moscow. During that reporting trip, he said he was invited to serve as an independent observer in Russia's presidential election and to meet Mr. Putin. He declined the invitation. There is another curious Russian common denominator. 6 of Sweden's alt-right sites have drawn advertising revenue from a network of online auto parts stores based in Germany and owned by 4 businessmen from Russia and Ukraine, 3 of whom have adopted German-sounding surnames for some reason. I don't know. It doesn't say that in there, but that's for some reason. That must be something, right? The ads were first noticed by the Swedish newspaper, Dagens Nyheter, again with the same Nyheter root in there. Dagens Nyheter is my best guess. Dagens. I'm noticing that those G's get dropped a lot. Which discovered that while they appeared to be for a variety of outlets, all traced back to the same Berlin address and were owned by a parent company, Autodoc GmbH, that German corporate abbreviation. The Times found that the company had also placed ads on anti-Semitic and other extremist sites in Germany, Hungary, Austria, and elsewhere in Europe, which raised a question. Was the auto parts dealer simply trying to drum up business, or was it also trying to support the far-right cause? Richard Lindholm, co-founder of a data-driven marketing firm who has worked with Swedish authorities to combat disinformation, dug deeper into the Autodoc network. Hidden beneath the user-friendly interface of some of the earliest Autodoc sites lay what Mr. Lindholm, an expert in the forensic analysis of online traffic, described as icebergs of blog-like content completely unrelated to auto parts, translated into a variety of languages. A visitor to one of the car parts sites could not simply access this content from the homepage. Instead, one had to know and type in the full URL. It's like they have a back door and it's open and you can have a look around, but to do that you have to know that the door is there, Mr. Lindholm said. Much of the content was not political, but there were links to posts about a range of divisive social issues, some of them translated into other languages. One hidden link about female genital mutilation in Muslim countries had been translated from English to Polish before being posted. Yet another post from a site called Answeringislam.net concluded, "Islam hates you." That's pretty blunt. Thomas Casper, spokesman for Autodoc, said the company had, quote, "no interest at all in supporting alt-right media," and added, "we vehemently oppose racism and far-right principles." He said the company's digital advertising team worked with a third party to place ads on, quote, "trusted websites with substantial traffic," unquote. Autodoc, he said, had instituted controls to try to ensure that it no longer advertised on far-right sites. As for the iceberg, after receiving the Times' inquiry, the company removed what Mr. Casper called the obviously dubious and outdated content. It had originally been placed there, he said, to improve search engine optimization. But Mr. Lindholm said that made no sense. By linking to irrelevant content, it actually hurt their business because Google frowns on that, he said. A new section entitled Links Abroad. Another way to look inside the explosive growth of Sweden's alt-right outlets is to see who is linking to them. The more links, especially from well-trafficked outlets, the more likely Google is to rank the sites as authoritative. That, in turn, means that Swedes are more likely to see them when they search for, say, immigration and crime. The Times analyzed more than 12 million available links from over 18,000 domains to 4 prominent far-right sites. There was the Nyheter Idag. Why am I even trying to figure this out again? The Samhällsnytt, Fria Tider, and Nya Tider. The data was culled by Mr. Lindholm from 2 search engine optimization tools and represents a snapshot of all known links through July 2nd. As expected, given the relative paucity of Swedish speakers worldwide, including here at Kagro in the Morning World headquarters, most of the links came from Swedish language sites. But the analysis turned up a surprising number of links from well-trafficked foreign language sites, which suggests that the Swedish site's rapid growth has been driven to a significant degree from abroad. It has the makings, the characteristics, of an operation whose purpose or goal is to help these sites become relevant by getting them to be seen as widely as possible, Mr. Lindholm said. Overall, more than 1 in 5 links were from non-Swedish language sites. English language sites, along with Norwegian ones, linked the most, nearly 1 million times. But other European language far-right sites, Russian, but also Czech, Danish, German, Finnish, and Polish, were also frequent linkers. The Times identified 356 domains that linked to all 4 Swedish sites. Many are well known in American far-right circles. Among them is the Gatestone Institute, a think tank whose site regularly stokes fears about Muslims in the United States and Europe. Its chairman until last year was John Bolton, now Mr. Trump's national security advisor. Great. And its funders have included Rebecca Mercer, a prominent, wealthy Trump supporter. You all know her as the big supporter of Cambridge Analytica, or the part owner, was she? But big supporter of Steve Bannon anyway, and patron of his so-called political career. Other domains that linked to all four Swedish sites included Stormfront, one of the oldest and largest American white supremacist sites, Voice of Europe, a Kremlin-friendly right-wing site, a Russian-language blog called Sweden4, the number 4, rus.nu, and freewelt.net, a site supportive of the AfD in Germany. I guess Free World or something like that in German, right? This loosely knit global network does not just help increase readership in Sweden. Researchers have tracked how Russian state outlets like RT and Sputnik, along with Western platforms like InfoWars and Breitbart, have picked up and amplified Swedish immigration-related stories to galvanize xenophobia among their audiences. Bjorn Palmertz, a disinformation specialist at the Swedish Defense University, said this information laundry has resulted in globally viral stories like the one about the Swedish town that allowed a mosque to issue calls to prayer while denying a church's application to ring its bells. Never mind that the church had not applied. But I guess that's story enough. Do you have to apply to ring your bells? Next section, the Village of the World. The auditorium at Rinkebyskolan, who knows, a middle school across the street from Rinkeby's town square, filled rapidly. Women wearing hijabs and burqas spilled in, taking their seats on the left. Men sat to the right. From the speakers came the voice of an imam reading from the Quran. Developed as part of a 1960s-era government initiative to build 1 million affordable dwellings, Rinkeby was originally home to a mix of Swedes and laborers from southern Europe. Over time, it became known as Sweden's Village of the World, with people from more than 100 countries, although maybe they're companies now at this point, living in drab, low-slung apartment blocks. Today, more than 91% of Rinkeby's roughly 16,400 residents are immigrants and their children. At a long table in front of the auditorium sat Niklas Andersson, a towering man who serves as Rinkeby's police chief. Once prayers concluded, the audience began peppering him with questions. Some worried about drug trafficking inside the apartment complexes, others about the prevalence of guns. Could the police install more cameras? To be sure, Mr. Anderson said in an interview afterward, there were problems in Rinkeby, his posting for 18 years, but it is hardly the hellscape that nationalists bent on painting Sweden as a failed state hold it out to be. Many newcomers still struggle to get a foothold in the job market, so unemployment is still relatively high at 8.8%. And in the larger Rinkeby-Kista borough, there were 825 reported episodes of violent crime last year, a rate 39% higher per capita than Stockholm as a whole. But Mr. Anderson does not recognize the Rinkeby portrayed in the movie, directed by a filmmaker who has shot political ads for Republicans in Congress, that led Mr. Trump to make his last night in Sweden remarks. Rinkeby is not a no-go zone, Mr. Anderson said, an assertion supported by the film's chief cameraman, who has acknowledged that officers who seemed to suggest otherwise had been edited out of context. In fact, the number of police officers in Rinkeby has more than quadrupled since 2015. Assaults and robberies are down, Mr. Anderson said. Fatal shootings are down too. Of 11 in Stockholm last year, 1 was in Rinkeby. Nationally, the violent crime rate is 1/5 that of the United States. It was a heavily slanted picture, Mr. Anderson said. You zero in on a couple of incidents, then use that to describe the whole area. By the time Trump zeroed in on Rinkeby, the government was tackling the problems, said Amila Mahovic, a reporter for Swedish public television. When the actual clash broke out soon after, she said, community elders spread word to local youths, you need to stop this. But soon, they said, they found out that outside forces wanted the world to see a different picture. Khalid Mohammed, then a researcher for public television, said he had spoken to a reporting team from Russia and Ukraine in Rinkeby Square that week and had tried to ask about Russia. They changed the subject to how multiculturalism doesn't work, he recalled, and then they quickly connected that to the clash. I want you to talk about the riot. Do you think this is connected to the influx of immigrants? Hani al-Salah, a Syrian who came to Sweden as a teenager, was working as a guard in Rinkeby. Tall and muscular with a sculpted beard, Mr. Salah, known as Amo, or Uncle by the local youth, said 3 young immigrants he knew told him that the Russian journalists had tried to bribe them with 400 kroner, about $43 apiece. Boys, do you want to do some action in front of the camera? They said. The Russian journalist asked them. Amazing. There's a bit more here, almost toward the end, but we're not going to make it all the way there before signing off for the day, but I think you get the picture. Stay tuned for more about this in coming days.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Thanks for joining us for today's pre-recorded show. I didn't want to leave you hanging on a Thursday. Don't know whether we're going to be able to get to a Friday and or Monday show. Maybe back on the air live on Monday as it happens anyway. But do stay tuned for Justice Putnam and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy live coming up next right here on Networks Radio.